Hi, we pick up Luke today in chapter 4, verse 38. And as you can see on the left side of your screen, we have a change of location here. We hear after leaving the synagogue in Capernaum, he entered Simon's house. Now, Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever, and they asked him about her. So a lot of things already going on that raise some questions. As you can see on the right side of the screen, Luke is adapting, as we saw in the previous scene of the synagogue demon in Capernaum, his source Mark. And yet, as you can see just glancing over it in the bold sections, that they're very different. That although Luke is taking over Mark's story about a healing of Simon's mother-in-law, it's in many ways a very different story. And one of the ways it's a very different story is in terms of narrative context, one of the tools we've been using to learn how to interpret a passage based on where it is in the particular narrative. So Luke's is in chapter 4, verse 38. Mark's is in chapter 1, verse 29, right near the beginning. And yet, by this time, Mark has Jesus already having gathered a few disciples, and Luke has not. In fact, when we hear about Simon here in verse 38, as readers, we have no idea who he is. I'm sure any reader who's the slightest bit familiar with the Jesus story, even if not familiar with Luke's gospel, would say, oh, Simon Peter, the one upon whom Jesus founded the church, or something like that. And yet, as it turns out, maybe I should put this as a trivia question, how many Simons are there in Luke's gospel, and save it for the end? But I won't do that. There are actually 4. And only one of them, of course, is Simon Peter. And when Simon is introduced as Peter in chapter 6, he's not only the only Simon in that paragraph. We'll also hear there about Simon the Zealot. And that's in chapter 6. And in chapter 7, there's a Simon who's a Pharisee, whose house Jesus is in with a woman of the city. And then near the end, there's Simon of Cyrene, who's enlisted to carry Jesus' cross. After these initial scenes, Simon, who we know as Simon Peter, is never called Simon again. He's only called Peter. And yet, he's called Peter before the text narrates that Jesus changed his name to Peter. And here he's called Simon, and Jesus has a relationship with them because he goes into their house and they ask him about her, etc. So these are not strangers, and yet we as readers know nothing about it. We'll only be introduced to them as in relationship later. So Luke is doing a very different thing and throwing off readers in many ways. And as we'll see throughout this passage and the one that follows, Jesus has crowds around him, but as yet he has no disciples or no apostles. And even as we'll see in the next scene, when Simon is called to follow, the verb for follow is used, but not the noun disciple or the noun apostle. Disciple will come up later in chapter 5 and without explanation, and then apostle will come up in chapter 6. And as we'll see, Luke uses apostle way more than any of the other gospel writers and disciples less. And yet at this point we know nothing about who this Simon is, where his house is, where his mother-in-law is, or any of that stuff. It's just as if we came into a story in the middle, or as if we'd missed something. But plainly we haven't missed anything. The data just haven't been there. So Simon's house, this is the only time we ever hear of anybody who becomes a disciple having a house. Otherwise, they're on the road with Jesus. We never see them at home. It's only this scene that's at home. Notice in the Markan version how different they are at the start. As soon as they left the synagogue, they, so not just Peter, but they, entered the house of Simon and Andrew. It's a house they share with James and John. So it's the house of Simon and Andrew, 2 brothers, and then James and John, 2 other brothers, and they're with Jesus entering in this house. But here we just see Jesus, as far as we know, entering into the house. He entered the house. And as far as we know, Simon was already there, or maybe he wasn't there because he's not named in the story, just the mother-in-law. Notice there's no father-in-law named there, nor are Simon's parents named. The fact that he's closer to his apparent wife's mother would suggest perhaps that his parents are dead, or they're certainly not named in the story, as are not named any of the other disciples' parents. And of course, we'll rarely see Jesus' parents named anymore either, although we will occasionally, but not very much. So a lot that's mysterious about this here. Curiously, the phenomenon of Simon's house is something that is preserved, and we can see at least a picture of what purports to be that from Capernaum. And maybe I should go back to the map and explain something of where we are here in terms of location. So if we go back to our map, we're in Capernaum here. Jesus had come from Nazareth over here, and he was in the synagogue in Capernaum, and he's right there. And as I showed last time, I won't show it again now, on Google Maps, you can see a lot of close-up pictures of Capernaum and see what a small place it is, and you can see a number of tourist pictures of this from a distance, but all that adds is pews in the back and people standing around. So this is this glass-covered viewing station that purports to be the house of Peter, the one that this scene is taking place in Capernaum. I have no idea what the basis is for that. There's nothing at the location where I took this picture to suggest what the archaeological basis is for determining that this particular square is Peter's house. But it's certainly not a house. It's just a pile of rubble. But it was certainly in this small town that is Capernaum, and whether it's that place or not, it's hard to say. But it's certainly a place that became revered as that throughout the centuries. So here's our location. So let's look a little more closely at our story, and then we'll bring up a couple other things. And I'll bring this back up so we can follow this along the way, comparison Mark with Luke. So Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a fever. Mother-in-law, first of all, is a rare word, and the only other, it's following Mark here, and the only other use is a negative one. I'll bring that up so you can see from 1253 about division. Father against son, son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. But of course, the mother-in-law here has no daughter-in-law in the scene because we don't have any sense that there is another daughter, in-law or otherwise. So Simon is here with his mother-in-law and nobody else in the family as far as we can tell. And it says she was suffering, and the word suffering here, suniko, is 9 of 12 times in the New Testament or in Luke Acts, but its meaning is closer to constrain or oppress, not suffer, according to the Liddell Scott lexicon. And that's relatively important here because the issue isn't so much that she's suffering in the sense that she's in pain, but that the Jubilee call for Jesus to release the oppressed is being made manifest here. The fulfilled this day is going through this process of fulfillment. And that's indicated by the fact that unlike what we might think of as a fever, it's something that Jesus rebukes, as we see in verse 39, and then the narrative summary is about both diseases and demons. So not a sharp line here between illnesses that are caused by what we might call biology or biological agents versus demons. Which brings up something that's worth comparing here, and I was going to bring it up a little later, but I might as well bring it up now, which is how we see healing, illness, and demonic possession in this Galilee ministry section in Luke 4-9 that we're looking at. So you can see at the top a number of programmatic statements. Some scholars refer to them as summary statements, and the first one of those is at the end of our passage, middle of our passage. You can see it on the left side of the screen right there. All those who had any who were sick with various kinds of diseases brought them to him, and he laid his hands on each of them and cured them. And then we see similar parallels, all of these in this first section, the ministry in Galilee. And then I provided here for you, I won't go over it in detail, but I'll post it on the webpage, the various ways that there's healing. So notice that rebuke is used both for a demon and for a fever, and then for a demon again, but also for wind and waves. So for a number of things. There's no sharp categories that one kind of ailment or oppression is ended one way and another way. So there's healing by rebuke, healing by touch, healing by word, and then this, I think, interesting list of all the different parts that are made whole by Jesus throughout the gospel. So worth looking at that if you're not familiar, and also looking at what I provided last time, the language about demons and Satan and unclean spirits, if you're not familiar with that or haven't watched the last video. So here what she's suffering from is a megas, which is large, fever, a purito, and fever is only in these parallels in the synoptics and then in Acts, where Paul also heals a fever. In Deuteronomy is the only use of that term in the Septuagint, and there it's a list of all the covenant curses, all the terrible things that will happen to people if they don't obey God's commands, much like what we see in Leviticus 26 if they don't practice Jubilee, although purito is not listed in the Septuagint as one of the consequences there. So we could infer possibly that from Deuteronomy this is that she's suffering from the fact that people haven't practiced Jubilee, but perhaps that's extending beyond what the text invites us to specifically. And certainly we see the fever here in Mark, and Mark's story so far isn't as explicitly about Jubilee, although it includes Jubilee, but not as explicitly as Luke's has been with the quote from Isaiah 61 being fulfilled at the beginning of this chapter. And so they asked him about her, literally made a request. Erotao is different than just like asking a question. It's more like what we might think of as intercessory asking someone to do something. 22 times in Luke Acts of the 57 times in the Gospel, so roughly proportionally. And as my note suggests here, revealing an incipient belief in Jesus' power to heal, contrasting with their amazement at his power and authority. In other words, rather than just being in sort of awe and mystery about what he's doing, they're seeing there's power there and they're asking. They're making a request. What they believe Jesus can do or what he can't do isn't clear, but they're coming toward him expecting perhaps that he can do something. We don't hear them speak, though. It's just the narrator who tells us. And we also don't know who the they is. We don't know who else is in the house, presumably in a small village area, large village, small city like Capernaum. Again, population estimated about 1,500 at the time, whereas a village might be only a few hundred, but smaller than what we think of as a city, where most people would know about each other, that someone wouldn't be left with a high fever without somebody taking care of them. So there's a they there, but we don't know who the they is. Notice again the difference in Mark, that Jesus comes and takes her by the hand and lifts her up, but here he stood over her and rebuked the fever. Let's look at that a little more closely too. The phrase for he stood over here, apostas epano, only here in the New Testament, and as green notes signifying his authority over the fever. But if we look at each of these words separately, the stood and the over, we'll see where those are used elsewhere. But it's a dominating position here, not over her. It's not that it's a man over a woman. It's the fever that's being rebuked, plainly not the mother-in-law. So the word for rebuke here, epitemason, that we saw earlier in 435, again here, and notice again in 41 as part of the summary here. And a couple more times in this Galilee ministry, but then not until way later, as we'll see on the journey to Jerusalem. So, and it left her, or literally let go of her. And immediately she got up. And I note that this is one of the places where Luke expresses the suddenness, whereas usually it's Mark who does. So if we look back at Mark, we notice the language of immediacy in different words here. And they told him about her at once. And he came in and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her, and she began to serve them. And it's happening at once, and we see other places of that later. Here, Luke doesn't have that at the beginning, but he has it here. Immediately she got up and began to serve them. The word for serve, diakonai, is or to minister to. So it's the word from which you get deacons, and Luke will use that in Acts of the Apostles. So it's not meant to be subservient in a patriarchal sense here, that the woman is rightly doing what she should do, which is to serve the man. She's been empowered to do a diaconate in a sense, not in the formal sense, but to be serving there. And we'll see that that'll be a position that many women are in Luke's gospel, not because they're women, but because they're faithful, as we'll see. That all the disciples are called to do that regardless of gender. So after that very quick scene, notice just 2 verses, and in contrast narrative style with what we saw in the synagogue in Nazareth, where the narrator added a lot of detail about rolling up the scroll and sitting down and all those things to build up some suspense. Here, this is told very quickly. There's no direct speech at all, just the narrator talking, and it happens all at once. And then we get to the beginning of this summary here. So notice again the difference here in verse 40 and here. This has, as the sun was setting in that evening at sundown. Both of them indicating the end of the day in the Jewish cultural sense, which goes from sundown to sundown. So toward the end of the day, notice the difference here in Mark. They brought to him all who were sick. But it's reversed here. All those who had any who were sick brought them to him. So rather than some people bringing all who were sick, all those who had any kind of sick people with sicknesses or diseases brought those. Notice that Luke doesn't specify that people who had people possessed by demons were brought, but yet demons came out shouting. Also a difference here, Mark has the whole city was gathered around the door, which maybe echoes negatively the Sodom story, where the entire city of Sodom in Genesis 19 gathers around Lot's door, although one would expect here that these people are there wanting to be healed rather than to destroy. But it's an ominous scene with biblical echo here of the whole city gathered around the door, whereas Luke omits that, and perhaps he didn't like that ominous scene. Mark's gospel overall, if not ominous, is at least much more urgent and serious, and the battle lines are drawn early, and Jesus faces defensive battle against the opponents in Jerusalem and the scribes and Pharisees, and often against his own disciples. We returning to Luke here. As the sun was setting, all those who came, as we just saw. sick with various kinds of diseases. We'll look later at the language of healing and illness. This is one of the several words in Greek used this way, athenuntos, which literally means weakness and doesn't necessarily mean disease. It could mean any kind of physical weakness, which of course can be from various causes other than disease. But it's one of the words used in Koine Greek for some kind of illness. And the term various kinds here, although a rare term, is taken directly from Mark, so Luke is following his source there. The word for disease is an interesting one, nosois. Luke doesn't use it in the way Matthew uses it, which is equivalent to empire, what I call empire disease or Egypt disease, as my note down here says, from those examples from Exodus and Deuteronomy, where God says directly or through Moses, the dread diseases of Egypt, which I certainly take there as an ecological sense of disorder, that the diseases are caused by not caring for the earth properly, just as we experience today pandemics and various other diseases that come from not treating the earth well and releasing things that should have been frozen or otherwise not that we would not be vulnerable to. So there's a direct connection biblically often between human illness and the health of the earth, but Luke is not making that direct connection here. He's not using the word that way. And then he laid his hands on each of them and cured them. And as my note from Marshall has, it's unknown in Judaism as a form of healing, but a common expression of the conveying divine blessing. And certainly people raised in our days today in a Christian environment might or might not be familiar with laying on of hands to heal, depending upon what kind of Christianity you're raised in or practice. But this is the origin of anybody doing this in the New Testament here, is that Jesus is laying on hands and curing them using the verb therapeuo, another one of our words for healing from the Greek here, of course, from which we get the English word therapy. So let's move on and see a little bit of the rest of our screen here so we can finish our passage. So after that, we have another bit of a summary. Demons came out of many. Notice the reversing the order of events here. The exorcism follows the healing rather than the healing following an exorcism. Shouting, "You are the Son of God," just as they shouted in the previous scene, "the Holy One of God." Which leads us to pause for a moment. I didn't address this last time, but maybe this is a good time to address it. A question people often have is, why do the demons know so clearly who Jesus is, but his disciples don't seem to know? Because we see that they both shout, "You are the Son of God," and the narrator adds, they knew he was the Messiah. Notice how that's different than what we saw in Mark, because they knew him, as opposed to knew he was the Messiah. And Son of God and Messiah were not equivalent terms necessarily. They can be, like in Psalm 2, where God's Son is understood as one anointed. But Messiah could be, as we've looked at previously, a priest or someone else anointed. Messiah simply means an anointed one. And Son of God tends to mean someone chosen by God as king. So those overlap here, but they don't have to. And that's certainly not synonymous necessarily with the Holy One of God, not a term otherwise tested, and certainly not a messianic term as such. So why is it the demons know and the disciples don't? And there's no answer for that, other than in the apocalyptic tradition we know from texts like 1 Enoch or from Daniel. The reality is that the demons and the evil one, or the devil or Satan, however name we want to put on that, understand exactly what's at stake, whereas humans often, metaphorically blind or metaphorically deaf, or having been misled by leaders who are often misled by other leaders, or are deliberately misleading us because they don't like what Jesus says and they prefer power or money or status or whatever else they get from being misleading, as we saw the biblical prophets chastise the leaders of Jerusalem that led to exile in the time of the Babylonians 6 centuries before Jesus. So there are many reasons why ordinary people might not hear it as clearly as the demons do, who are not plagued by the illusions that empire provides, and don't need to be disillusioned as humans do. But that's just me talking. There's no specific reason here, and other scholars may offer various explanations for that. But in this summary for their naming, he rebuked them and would not allow them to speak. Notice how that's echoing the silencing last time, and we'll look back at a comparison of that in a second, because they knew. So why would he not want them to say he was the Messiah when that's the truth? And that has to do with the so-called messianic secret. And I'm not going to address that right now. I'm going to let that go right now. But we will come back to that. So stay tuned for a future opportunity to consider why Jesus doesn't want people to know he's the Messiah at this point. But that link here leads me to bring up this comparison between the previous scene and this scene. When we looked at 4:31 to 37 last time, I did the comparison of the Sabbath synagogue visit in Nazareth in the previous scene and the one in Capernaum in this scene, and they're very tightly related. These two stories are not as tightly related, but there are still several connections that highlights that Luke's narrative so far is following this chain of connections that links one story to the one before it. And so we see several aspects here, both the rebuking in purple here a couple of times, and as my note just showed you, rebuking is not common everywhere else. So there's a summary there. In the immediate moment, the silencing, the telling the demon to be silent and would not allow them to speak, the naming of Jesus as Holy One of God or Son of God, and the ministry in cities that we see in both places. So there are many ways in which these scenes continue a flow of introducing Jesus' ministry here. So we've seen him preach, we've seen him cast out demons, we're seeing him heal, and those are the primary expressions of what he's going to be doing throughout this ministry in Galilee. So the scene really changes at verse 42 from Mark. In Mark, we have, after the summary, we say, it says, in the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed, and Simon and his companions hunted for him. And it's literally a word for hunting, like you're hunting for an animal or a criminal. It's not like seeking to find someone that you love who's missing or you're just looking for. It's a very aggressive word. Whereas in Luke, as we see on the left or here, at daybreak he departed and went to a deserted place, and the crowds were looking for him because he has no disciples yet. He has no group of people. And it's the first time we're hearing about crowds. So let's look at that a little more closely on the Lucan side here. So at daybreak, literally when it became day, suggesting that he's been working all night here. There's no sense that he slept anywhere. If he did, it would have been at the house of Simon's mother-in-law, and that's not said. So at daybreak he departed there and went. And this is a particular Lukeism phrase here a number of times there. Luke has a number of these phrases. Sometimes he's borrowing language from the Septuagint to quote, make it sound biblical, the way nowadays we might say, love thy neighbor, to make it sound biblical, even though nobody uses the word thy these days. But he also has certain figures of speech that he uses, as most writers do. Certain phrases, this is one of them, departed and went. Into a deserted place or a wilderness, eremos. It's described there as a deserted place because where they are in Capernaum is not right by the desert, it's right by the lake. But it's to say an uninhabited place. And curiously, it's Luke who says he went out to pray at this point here, and not, Mark who said he went out to pray, and not Luke, whereas Luke is famous for including prayer as something that Jesus does much more than any of the other writers. So it's curious that Luke he prayed in his source from Mark and took it out. It's hard to imagine exactly why he did that there, but we can't exactly ask him, can we? And so the crowds were looking for him, epizuton here, in contrast with zetio, which is used 25 times, the basic word for seeking and finding, and often used in the pairing with seeking and finding, a theme that we'll see is common in Luke when we get to it a little later. And when they had reached him, they wanted to prevent him from leaving them. Literally the word means katiko, to hinder or hold fast. And as my note here from Green has here, the people at Capernaum also make the mistake of their counterparts in Nazareth. Failing to understand who Jesus is and therefore the scale of his mission, they hope to limit his ministry to their own boundaries. So just as the folks in Nazareth wanted to throw Jesus off the cliff because he wouldn't privilege Nazareth over Capernaum in the ongoing struggle for authority in the honor, shame, and patronage systems that governed the social order of the Greco-Roman world at the time, similarly in Capernaum, they want to prevent him from leaving. But at least when he decides to leave, they don't angrily want to throw him over the cliff for rejecting them. So Capernaum ends up treating him better than his hometown of Nazareth. And he expresses his reason for not leaving this way. I must, and the word for must, dei, is what's usually considered the divine must. Now, dei in all the Gospels suggests the must means that it's God's intention here. So we'll see it here and then a few other times. I must proclaim the good news. This is all one word in Greek, proclaim the good news. And it's the word from which we get the noun evangelize. You can see it here, euangizo. And it's a very Lucan word. It's 15 times in Acts and 21 times in Paul, of 54 times in the Gospels, plus all these times in Luke. So it's a very Luke word, as one word, proclaim the good news. And it's always about the good news of the kingdom of God. Notice it 32 times in Luke and 6 times in Acts, of 62 times in the New Testament. Whereas basileia, the word for kingdom, is 46 times in Luke, of 160 times in the New Testament, suggesting that the question of reign is at issue throughout, which isn't surprising given that Luke, one of the evangelists, who has at the beginning of his gospel timing like in the 15th year of the reign of the Emperor Tiberius. So Luke's Jesus is clearly presenting the kingdom of God as an alternative to the Roman Empire, as an expression of social order blessed by the gods. And it's important to hear that for Luke's audience, this would be a subversive, even treasonous message to listen to, and certainly one to claim, which is often why in Acts of the Apostles, people get in big trouble for it in the major cities of the empire. So what Jesus is announcing here is that what he's doing and what he's going to be soon calling others to do is subversive and will get them in trouble, and yet it's good news. Notice that he's bringing it to the cities and then concludes, "For I was sent for this purpose." Notice the language of sent, as we saw, is echoing Gabriel earlier as sent, and for this purpose here is literally upon this. But this is juxtaposed to what we saw earlier in this chapter, where we heard him proclaim that Jubilee was his purpose. So how do we connect the proclamation of Jubilee being fulfilled this day as his mission statement, as we called it, with now proclaiming the good news of the kingdom is the reason he was sent? And I'd like to suggest because they're the same thing. That the kingdom of God is the realm where there is Jubilee, where there is no domination, there is no hierarchy, there is no control of one group by another, there is no discrimination among groups. All the elements that Jubilee allows to happen, the dismissal of all debts and disease and demons and death, is the reign of God. So just another way to put what Jesus is about here. And it concludes here, he continued proclaiming the message in the synagogues of Judea. Note in Mark it ends with, he went through Galilee proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. But in Luke it has Judea. And that's very confusing. You see all the times Judea is listed here because they're not in Judea. And my note down here has a designation in Luke for all of Palestine as Jewish territory, but not always. Before we end today, just look briefly at a couple of examples of that we've already seen that show how Luke uses Judea both as the overarching place, much like Israel today includes both the previous provinces of Judah and Israel as a national name. Judea is what Luke uses in his place. So we saw in chapter 2, verse 4 this, Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea. So as different places. And in chapter 3, verse 1, a passage I already referred to indirectly, in the 15th year of the reign of Emperor Tiberius, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea and Herod was ruler of Galilee, indicating that those are separate places. But a couple chapters from where we are now, we hear this. He came down with them and stood on a level place, and this is still in Galilee until 951 when he begins the journey to Jerusalem, with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon. And Tyre and Sidon are to the north, and Judea and Jerusalem are way to the south, and yet it's suggesting that they're all here in this one place. And then another chapter later, in chapter 7, verse 17, we hear this word about him spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding country, but he's still in Galilee. So we can interpret that as Judea is hearing even from a distance, just as Jerusalem came out to John the Baptist, or Judea is his term for the entire area, the Jewish community, as it might be heard, as we take it in English form, as it might have been heard by a Koine Greek-speaking audience. So that's where we end chapter 4, and as we'll see as we begin chapter 5, Jesus' ministry in Galilee will continue with him by the lake and a crowd pressing. And finally, we'll deal with fishing. See you then for that. Bye-bye.